interested in these questions for some time, and I guess it's relatively recently we started having a conversation about it being qualitative longitudinal research, which is really interesting as well in terms of what gets, not just what is the L in QLR, but what gets called QLR, when and why is also an interesting issue. So what Liz is going to, Liz is a ESRC Professorial Fellow at University of Edinburgh, which means she's just got a very nice project which is going to enable her to develop her work around using correspondences and letters, both as a way of doing sociological history or historical sociology, but also as a serious investigation around methodology of what the, I think of as, what this says, one bloody thing after another, or one damn thing after another. What that kind of, working with that kind of material, what that gives us insights into, and what challenges it poses. So I'm going to give out some leaflets about the project that Liz is going to be talking about. So if you could just take one. Should I start? What? Yes. Right, so Michelle sat down. So this is going to have, I think, 38 minutes. 34 and a half. Okay, precisely. And then we'll have some plenty of time for discussion and reflection after that. So right, I should say that Alan's comments about proper sociology have got me worried, so my eyes on you, lad. Mine is the improper version, almost certainly. And I'll take up perhaps another 30 seconds, a bit more than 34 and a half minutes, and say that I am not a resurrectionalist in the terms used by the late great Philip Abrahams, Professor of Historical Sociology at Durham. I do not believe that the past can be resurrected before us. I do not believe that Rome can be rebuilt. What I'm interested in are representations of the past, and I do not accept the referentiality between those representations of the past and the thing that was lived by those who are dead in any straightforward fashion. So please don't pigeonhole me as either a resurrectionalist or as somebody methodologically naive. I might be naive in lots of other ways, but perhaps not that one. You'll have seen an abstract of what I'm going to talk about. Since the abstract was written, a lot of water and a lot of research has flown under the bridge, and the title of what I'm talking about, as you see, has changed, and I'll explain why I'm interested in series, sequence and the other terms in the process of exploring my ideas for a formal analysis regarding a particular qualitative longitudinal research project about white people writing whiteness in South Africa from the 1770s to the 1970s using letters, and concerning race, always in screamers, as a proxy, and changes in the way that they represented race as a proxy for thinking some thoughts about social change more generally. And it builds on an earlier project that I was PI of, which was concerned with researching and analysing and also publishing the nearly 5,000 letters of the South African feminist writer and social theorist Olive Schreiner. And it builds on that in a number of ways. Firstly, the Schreiner project really brought home to me that South Africa, if you're a sociologist, is the crucible for thinking about societal level social change. Because in a comparatively short time period, it's gone through 4 major transitions. Pre-colonialism, pastoralism, hunter-gathering and agrarianism. From that to colonialism mixed with agrarianism, to a minerals revolution, diamonds and gold, and enclave capitalism, Johannesburg, the quintessence of it, to a variant local form of capitalism mixed with agrarianism, to the late 1980s, early 1990s transition to democracy, or something pretty close to it, with attendant complicated mixtures over time of social stasis, things more or less stay the same for large parts of the time, as well as social transition, something's changed. Secondly, that project also confirmed that letters really are an important index of such change. Letterness and the workaday variants of the epistolary form, as Thomas and Zaniecki noted many years ago in The Polish Peasant in Europe and America, published in the very early part of the 20th century.
in which there were mobilities and all the things that people are telling us are brand new were actually going on then. That letters are highly porous to changing social conventions. The genre and the genre conventions morph with the times. Those of you who text and Twitter, or twit as it was referred to on a programme about the Queen last night, know what I mean about the morphing with the times. So letters then are a particularly apposite form of data for a project like the Whites Writing Whiteness one, which is concerned with mapping and understanding how people represent status and change. Also, that previous project showed that there was an increasing movement in terms of what's actually in those letters and those in the people that Schreiner corresponded with, away from using other categories and the growing centrality of race in the ways that they represented, categorised, and probably also, certainly also, treated people. But while this is clear at a state and governmental level, in the data, in the letters, it's not always discernible in that representational medium. And I'm interested in exploring these kinds of disarticulations between what's happening at a social structural level and what's happening in different places amongst different people in different parts of the country at a local level. And focusing on the longue durée and letters en masse enables tracing out how letter writing as a representational form was deployed in depicting, in representing the racial order over the period the research is concerned with, a 200-year period. And the case for analysis in both of those projects, another thing that's carried forward from the Schreiner one, is that the case or the unit of analysis isn't people, it's the letter, aka practices, representational practices. So it's not the people who write letters, it's the letter writers, it's the representational practices that they engaged in when they wrote in circumstances of absence, or more usually of interrupted presence of a more temporary kind. South Africa has some extraordinarily rich collections located in archives all over the country. Their contents densely, to use another word used by Alan, densely cover the period from the 1770s to the 1970s and after that as well. They contain letters written by people from all white groups in South Africa, of different language groups and diverse European origins, including the relatively well-to-do and the comparatively down the heel. The contents consist primarily of letters, but also other epistolary writings such as cards, postcards, telegrams, wills, testimonies, depositions, and also diaries, journals, memoirs, and reminiscences, which bear a complicated relationship to epistolary. And that these archives are overwhelmingly, you'll not be surprised to hear, overwhelmingly filled with white writing is, of course, in project terms, not a problem. It's part of the very thing that's being investigated. How did South Africa turn out as it did, that such a very tiny number of white people ended up in such an incredibly powerful position vis-à-vis very large numbers of black people? Now, as I said before, letters are, of course, a representational form, and that's one of the sources of their interest. But not also, but they're not only this, for they also, albeit complexly, reference the social world, and that's a material as well as a social world of events, persons, and things. And because the project concern is with race and racism as well as change, these kinds of pushes and pulls between the representational aspects of letters and the material world that they index are fundamental to the analytical task that we're interested in. So, what is it that we're doing? And there's me, but there's also an RA, another research worker, and a technical officer, and a PhD student. So, the research will consist of 10 to 12 case studies focused on particular sets of letters, which are they either compose or are part of a bigger collection, with these located in a wider set of interconnected collections, around 50 of them. So 10 to 12 focused case studies and a whole bunch of others. And these contain the papers of a number of differently situated social groupings, with an example here. There are 165 very lengthy letters and reminiscences written in the form of letters by Elizabeth Lees Price, known as Bessie. And these letters will form one of the case studies. She married the missionary Roger Price, also vociferous, if you can be vociferous as a letter writer, but certainly a high-volume letter writer. Her mother, Mary Smith Moffat, and father, Robert Moffat, well-known missionaries, were also major letter writers. Her sister Mary married David Livingston, a well-known missionary and traveller. Both were letter writers, he on a very large scale. While her brother John Smith Moffat was originally a missionary but turned administrator who wrote hundreds of letters, with him and his wife Jane Unwin Moffat, also a copious letter writer. In addition, their eldest son, Robert Unwin Moffat, was his father's biographer and custodian of the family letters. He married a cousin, Helen Vavasseur, daughter of Bessie's oldest sister, and they were all prolific letter writers. Add to these, did they do anything else? I sometimes find myself wondering. The letters of John Mackenzie, a missionary also turned administrator and a long-term close friend of Roger Price. Those are James Reed Sr. and Jr., both radical missionaries with a very prickly relationship with the rest of it. James Reed Jr. was black and his mother was a Khoisan woman. Also those written by Gottlob Schreiner, Ollie Schreiner's father, and really in the same circles, and hundreds sent to the other person on that list, James Kitchingham. Together, these add up to about 9,000 or 10,000 letters in this span period from the 1810s to the 1940s. Bessie Price's very long letters were mainly written when she was living beyond the frontier, in what's now the borders of the end of South Africa and the beginnings of Botswana. These particular letters will be analysed in their own right, but also by bringing them into conversation, to use a term that's been used by Rachel, with a similar but earlier subset from her mother Mary Moffat, and a similar but later subset from her sister-in-law Jane Unwin Moffat, covering a crucial period, 40 years from 1820 to 1860, during which historiography, orthodox historiography, claims that the missionary discourse regarding race changed fundamentally. It became less liberal, non-egalitarian and racial. And they'll also be brought into dialogue with other subsets of letters from the men involved in this network as well. And all of these will be considered regarding letters from wider missionary circles written over that very long time period from 1810 to the 1940s, probably focusing on the letters of the London Missionary Society missionary Missy Tovey, who was also a missionary in similar areas. So this is one of the social networks that I'm interested in exploring. So multiply by 10 or 11. And alongside missionaries put slave plantation owners, people living through the 100 years of the Eastern Cape Frontier Wars, traders turned mine owners and discoverers of gold and diamonds, venture capitalists, lawyers, a political dynasty, and a list which will be expanded or modified as field work proceeds, with, we've calculated, the result being a data set of about 120,000 documents or cases, quite large in anybody's terms, quite large in quantitative terms. So how to handle such a very large amount of data within the framework of what is basically, if we have to plump for one side or another of this, what is basically a qualitative project. Well, I won't say anything about the mechanics of data handling and our use of a project design virtual research environment, as the website for the project will provide details if you're interested. And instead I'll focus on discussing the elements of what I mean by a formal analysis of a qualitative longitudinal research project devised to suit the particular concerns with exploring these kinds of networks. So by a formal analysis, I mean a kind of variant on the kind of thing that Georges Simmel's formal sociology is concerned with, in abstracting from content to focus on the core properties of, in Simmel's case, time, number, sociality, value, exchange, and so on, and then using those to go back to the heterogeneity of actual social phenomena to throw light on how they work concretely. And exploring what that might look like in relation to this project, I'll refer to two particular letter collections. Firstly, the already mentioned Bessie Price letters, and secondly, the Finlay family letters. And I'll focus on the formal properties of these, looking in closer and closer detail at particular series and sequences of letters, while for the purposes of what I'm talking about today, their specific content, exactly what they're about, has been bracketed. That is, I'm focusing on the formal properties. And the first four elements for discussion are figuration, the case or unit of analysis. None of these terms will be unfamiliar to you. They're fairly sort of standard in the methodological literature. So they're figuration, the case or unit of analysis, series, and connection. The concept of figuration, of course, comes from its use by Norbert Elias in the civilizing process. For Elias, social life is always ongoing, a sociogenesis. It's never in stasis, always in a process and state of becoming. An acts of ceteris paribus committed by researchers, that is, holding things still for research purposes, are, in Elias's terms, a violation of the fundamental properties of life as we know it. And he uses the concept of figuration, among other things, to convey the processual one damn thing following another of social life. And he helpfully likens it to a dance involving many people, which goes on over time. People join and leave, the dance continues, but few of those dancing at 7 p.m. are still there dancing away at 7 a.m. The Finley family collection, shown here, contains more than 9,000 interconnected series of letters, and this shows a small subset of its letter writings, with all of these people being both writers and recipients of letters within the collection. These 25 series of letter writings graphically show the joining and leaving aspect, the dance of continuing figuration. The Finley letters run from 1806 to 1933 continuously, and there's never a point, indeed there isn't a week, in which there are multiple letters being sent and received over this 127-year time period. But the people come and go. And what this also conveys is that the case, or the unit of analysis that I'm concerned with, isn't the people who write and receive letters, for they do indeed come and go. And this is instead the letters and continuing exchanges of letters over time within the figuration as a whole. And you can call them practices or representational practices if you prefer. I used the term series just now to refer to these exchanges of letters, the progression of correspondence over time of letter writing and replying by these named writers and their addressees. And of course, the dance continues and they swap roles. So expressed simply, each of these names up there represents correspondence and exchange, letters from and also to these people over time. And while the whites writing whiteness interest in letters is in an important part regarding their content, for today's purposes I'm bracketing that, because it's also in part concerned with the iterative dynamics of these exchanges and the connections between people that they establish. The letters have a very strong I, to, and from you character or ontology. Think of email as a proxy. This introduces the fourth formal term of connection, of bridging interrupted presence and longer-term absence between people through letters being sent and replied to, their gift or exchange or sociality aspect, and also through their communicative content, with both of them connoting their equally strong between and exchange character. Mapping the basics of letter exchanges and points of connection within the Finley letters and other collections of letters provides useful pointers for where more detailed investigations might be in order. For instance, at the top of the slide regarding the McRoberts, not shown on that first figure, there are in fact over 150 letter exchanges involving them in the collection. And looking more closely at their presence, John McRobert is a friend of John Finley the Younger, who married Olive Schreiner's sister Katie. And McRobert became a partner in the law firm of the Finley's son, Hudson Finley. Then his letters to John peter out after his marriage. This was to Annie, a cousin of the Finleys, a direct cousin of the Finleys, and she contributed letters to Katie Finley, wife of John the Younger, over an approximately 32-year period. Their daughter Kathleen, shown third down there, was a friend of her second cousin George Finley, son of Hudson and Katie, with the connection enhanced when George married one of her other friends, Joan Rose Innes. Thus, as the connection became closer, Kathleen in effect joined the dance of these interrelated letter writers. The other three at the top. At the bottom of the slide, you'll see there's a paucity of Murray family letters in the Finley collection. That there are any came about through the friendship based on a sharing of religious fundamentalism between Katie Finley and a man called Emil Niemeyer, with the family connection between the Niemeyers and the Murrays occurring through another family connection, Gustav Niemeyer, who later became a partner in Hudson Finley's law firm. So you can see how closely interconnected these people were. And I'll return to the Murray connection in a bit. Thinking about figuration, my first four terms, figuration, unit of analysis, series and connection, in relation to the Finley letters, then raises some interesting pointers for where a closer examination might go, by showing the overtime changing patterns in the figuration, and examining people's letter writing and when that started and when it finished, exploring who wrote to whom and changes in it, and through this interrogating the changing structure of the letter writing, which is what Elias and this project means by the idea of a figuration. So I'll talk about the next four terms of sequence, variance, temporal ordering and interval in relation to the Bessie Price letters. There are 165 extant letters by Bessie Price, many of them very long, written from September 1854 to May 1900, shown in the table at the top of the slide, broken down by their addressees, the person who she addressed them to. While in the figure at the bottom, her letter writing is shown as a series, and it could have been accompanied by other series within the interconnected Price, Moffat, Livingston, etc., letters, and so be shown like the multiple series that compose the Finley letters figuration that I showed before. I don't want to do that, I want to do something else. Looking more closely at the temporal ordering of the Price series, as on that slide, and taking into account not only her letters to different people, but also shown at the top her letter-like reminiscences, which have internal dates of writing and the names of the addressees they were being addressed to and sent to in them. What comes into sight is that series here is less a fully articulated figurational order, like the Finley collection overall, and more something which is, as you see on the slide, something composed by a number of sequences, a term I use to indicate identifiable sub-elements in a series, that is, linked data events with particular shared features. And it's clear in this instance that these sequences concern the different addressees or recipients, so I want to take a quick look at one of them. This shows Bessie Price's letters to her sister Jeannie Moffat, written between 1866 and 1868. And as you can see, there are actually two sequences there, involving concentrations of letter writing at different points in time with a break, and thus variance in sequencing, with variance being the term I use to indicate gaps or breaks in a series or sequence, marking sequences off from each other, and so characterising or breaking up or disturbing duration. Another formal analysis term I'll return to in a minute. The two sequences here are June 1866 to February 1867, and October 1867 to March 68, separated from each other by an 8-month gap. However, Bessie Price's letter-like reminiscences, which I referred to on the previous slide, were addressed and sent to a number of people at different points in time, who then sent them on to others, with Jeannie Moffat being the person they were sent to over the large part of the interval between those two sequences. So what seems like the absence of letters and possible gaps, as indicated by sequencing and variance, is actually covered by this other kind of epistolary writing that Betty Price engaged in. Her letters, her reminiscences are written as letters. However, not all variance in sequencing is filled in that way, as another example will show. This is Bessie Price's letters to her 4 eldest children who went to school in Britain in 1879, remaining there until 1884, a 5-year period. And it shows a seeming increase in 1880 over 1879 of letters, and a seeming sharp decrease from 1881 to 1883. However, this table, which you see here, looks more closely at the letter writing flows and shows the number of letters per month over this period. The variance on a month-by-month basis is not so sharp as just plotting series overall might imply. And even the 1881 monthly count suggests a more gentle decrease when looked at like this. However, 1882 and 1883 stand out because there are actual breaks in sequencing, not just increases and decreases. So variance here is marked and indicates something it might be interesting to investigate further. And the reminiscences once more provide a clue. They suggest that letters were indeed written and sent. And relatedly, the 4 eldest Price children were initially all together in Britain, living with an aunt. But in 1882, they were sent to different schools in different parts of the country, with the letters being sent round Britain between them. It seems possible that one of the children along the line didn't receive or didn't keep the letters dispatched by their mother, with just a handful surviving perhaps of the likely greater number that she sent. So maybe happenstances involved here. Variance then indicates something which further investigation can perhaps usefully pick up on and look at in more detail. But there are other things too about these letters to the oldest children that a formal analysis can alert the researcher to regarding their temporal and spatial aspects. This table looks closer still at the same subset of Price letters, focusing specifically on those written during the 7 months from January to the end of July 1879. The majority, 16 out of 23, are inscribed with multiple dates. In the case of that dated the 28th of May to the 25th of June, for instance, the question arises as to whether this, which is written and looks like a continuous letter, should be considered as just one letter, or 29 of them as it has 29 internal and different dates. Temporal ordering, then, is the next formal analysis term, and is by no means always straightforward when looked at closely, like this. In addition, examining the time of the letters, rather than the time as it's written about in them, brings into sight the material aspects of where, as well as when they were written by reference to address, with some of the complexities shown there. Letters as a formal genre, as I noted earlier, are marked by a between and exchange ontology. That's what they're about. It's me to you and you to me. And Bessie Price's letters and others written in southern Africa at that time have this characteristic in spades, moving between what are now long, although quick distances apart, as you may imagine, was then long and slow, and with between, as in some of these letters, about as specific as place could get. So this table shows the epistolary movements of the Price parents and their younger kids back from furlough in South Africa after leaving the 4 eldest there. And they moved from a ship to a boarding house to an ox-drawn wagon that wended its slow 6-month way from Cape Town to Molopololi, just over the border in what's now Botswana. And just now an 18 or 19-hour drive, rather than their 6-month trip from Cape Town. And as for 1879, so 1881, and a closer scrutiny of addresses shows that travels by Bessie Price lie behind the complexities marking those apparently simple counts of letters that I showed earlier, and the increases and decreases that separate and mark off the letter sequences. Looking now at one small, very specific sequence of Price letters, those of January to May 1900. These are addressed to sons and daughters all, and the formal element of interval is helpful here in understanding some important features. By interval, I mean the relationship and gap between items of data in a sequence or series, and recognising that such intervals can have different values, often but not necessarily involving time. However, it's often temporal intervals and variants that alert the researcher to something interesting going on, as with this example. This is the only sequence of letters addressed in this way, to sons and daughters all, so it stands out. And as a distinct sequence within the series, it indicates there might be something useful to look more closely at. The context was in fact the final illness and death of their father and Bessie Price's husband, Roger Price, on the 21st of January 1900, with all the Price children at that time living either overseas or long distances away in southern Africa. But even so, the Bessie Price letters sent to them after he died are oddly irregular, and also oddly, they occasion no response at all. These are the Bessie Price letters. She got no replies back. The background circumstances were of the South African War of 1899 to 1902 and the occupation of the area where Bessie Price lived by a Boer commando that enforced martial law, censorship, strict prohibitions on travel and also on writing letters. These regulations were focused in particular on the mission station's occupants, perceived as troublemakers, including the Prices, because they were liberal renegades, and with one of the occupants, the Reverend John Tom Brown, forcibly expelled. It's the intervals marking the irregular temporal spaces between these letters I want to say just a little something about. There are multiple dating within these letters, including the first one in January 1900 and a later one in March. There are also indications that multiple letters were written and sent, but where either the duplicate or the original, you can't tell from the way that they're written, is no longer extant. And there are also signs that there were other letters that were written and sent, but which never arrived. And also, not only unpacking how many there were, but unpacking who is the addressee is equally complex. Over January, February and March, letters were dispatched with John Tom Brown when he was expelled, others were sent with passing traders, all of them addressed to third parties. So there were letters within letters, and sometimes letters within letters within letters. And it's those letters within letters within letters that are addressed to sons and daughters all. So even at the end of April and through into May, Bessie Price had no idea whether any of her letters had arrived. No replies were received. So interval, the size and character of interval, is also important in alerting us to possibilities for closer investigation. So, I'll now return to the Finlay collection to comment on the final two formal elements of duration and number that I'm interested in, and I'll do so in the form of a cautionary tale. Duration is a term I use to indicate the span or persistence of a series or sequence, being often implicitly and sometimes explicitly temporal in character, and so concerning longevity. While number is the count of cases, of series, of sequences and figurations. And more importantly, of course, it's the number of these which is appropriate and sufficient for the analytical tasks in hand. The temptation, however, is to think that duration or longevity and number or size are important in themselves, and of course they're not. Long and short, big and little aren't values in and of themselves. They're possible pointers to things we might look at and think at and consider. So keep in mind, Katie Finlay and Eugene Murray, 53 years of letter writing, 12 years of letter writing, 1,643 plus letters, and 57. Depicted in another way here. Katie Finlay was Olive oldest sister, and she was a queen bee in the letter writing networks cohering around the Finlay family, which she married into, as her father-in-law John Finlay the elder was before her, and then her son Hudson, followed by her grandson George and his wife Joan Rose Innes, were after her. She's a major letter writer and even more so a major letter recipient over this family figuration for a very long period of time, 53 years, and involving extremely large numbers of letter exchanges, over 1,600 letters. Many of these letters are duty letters of children at school, husband away trading, fairly formulaic letters to family, friends, passing strangers who stayed with them on anniversaries and occasions. Many of them are just a word to say we are all well kind. But the letters are extremely interesting in their ordinariness, and in particular in their mass. They're to and from an uneducated backcountry woman with many children who is managing a huge farming and trading household. And she is unusually, and indeed almost uniquely, well documented as such. Eugene Murray, some of you may have heard about, he is a major figure of South African Afrikaans language literature and especially poetry, as well as having been a lawyer friend of lawyer George Finlay, the son of Katie, and also meeting through Gustav Niemeyer, so that the connection of the Finlay and Murray families was through Gustav Niemeyer, who I mentioned earlier. Eugene Murray's letters lasted for just 12 years, and there's only one letter extant in that correspondence from George to Eugene Murray, which is in fact a copy. And so nearly 56 from Murray to George. But what letters they are. They're extremely long, exuberant, packed with literary and political ideas and poems, and they burst into the mass of kindly dutifulness of just a word to say I'm well kind, with all the noisy conceit of a dirty great peacock amongst some rather dusty sparrows. So Katie Finley and Eugene Murray. This is chalk and cheese and fish and bicycles. Both sets of letters, as here, can be plotted by reference to their duration and number, as on the slide. But direct comparison would need to take account of the specificities and differences, and I think in this example, and probably in many others, is best avoided. Size doesn't give it all. And so whether duration and number are analytically important, of course, all depends on content and context. Some concluding points then. A formal analysis of the kind I've sketched out takes the qualitative longitudinal researcher, I think, quite a long way before ever plunging into the detailed content of a data set. In this case, the 200 years of letter writing by many, many white South Africans. And marshalling its tools, the tools of formal analysis, can help direct more focused, detailed inquiry in a fruitful way. My version of formal analysis, which I've spoken about this afternoon, is focused on features of the structure of the letters and collections that the White's Writing Project is working with each formal element helping give considered thought to the configuration of the data across collections, across series, and over time, with variance in any of these elements providing the researcher with useful pointers which can direct analytic attention to figuring out the hows and wherefores of this. What I've been talking about is, if you want to call it this then, a form of secondary analysis, in that the data I'm working with is all a given, it's found, and this has to be worked with. You can't go out and dig them up and get them to say, or write anything else. But while quite a few people at the Cardiff seminar before this one in the series saw secondary analysis as impoverished within a QLR framework because lacking the insights and special knowledge that originators of their own researcher-generated data sets have, for me, secondary analysis of this kind has particular strengths, not least because it has within it the possibility of a fresh eye being cast over things, and it makes possible new interrogations of tired old orthodoxies, many of which lurk behind this data. Also, concern was expressed by various people in Cardiff about attrition in qualitative longitudinal research, with terms like hunting and stalking being used, about literally, for you weren't there, hunting and stalking, tracking down and finding the people who are the research subjects in order to make them be interviewed when they're trying to get away. Much, if not all, of what I've been talking about has been concerned with the analytical benefits and insights that comes from attrition. The absences from, also the gaps, the intervals and variance in these collections and series of letters. For me, so-called attrition massively contributes to and helps compose the structure and ontological character of it all. It drives a good deal of the analysis we're carrying out, and I wouldn't be without it. Indeed, it wouldn't be without it. This is, I think, the best way to respond to the question in my abstract concerning whether there are important differences that come with the found or naturally occurring in streamers data of a figurational kind that I'm working with, as compared with data that's researcher designed, as featured in many other qualitative longitudinal research projects, probably most of you in the room. That is, I don't have the luxury, but I don't have the burden either of thinking that attrition is a problem. It's simply the name of the game. They all die. People in the past are all dead. And the letters always start, but they also always end as well. An analytical stance has to fully reckon with this. From a formal analysis perspective, the kind that I've taken up, a slightly slick answer to the question posed in my abstract concerning when is it that qualitative longitudinal research actually becomes longitudinal rather than a repeat of a cross-section. The response I'm making is that this occurs at the point at which it grapples with the fundamental features, properties, elements, call them what you will, of longitudinality. This is what I'm trying to do here. And like Frank Sinatra, I've done it my way, and I hope, I won't sing, don't worry. And as I hope I've conveyed, this is because I'm endeavouring to be as analytically responsive as possible to the ontological character of the particular data I'm working with. Consequently, the answer to the last question in my abstract follows. The question in the abstract concerns how figuration, case, series, connection, variance, temporal ordering, interval, duration, number might shape up regarding other qualitative longitudinal research, perhaps yours. And indeed whether these elements will be relevant or not, or whether other formal properties might be more significant. And so my answer to that has to be, over to you folks, you tell me, is it relevant, or is this utterly specific to Liz Stanley's funny old little project in South Africa?
Thanks a lot, Liz. That was great. Okay, we've got a bit of time for people to respond and answer some of your questions. So, can we, people let me know if they've got something they want to raise in relation to what Liz was saying? Or, I mean, literally the question of how do you take something, generalise or apply some of your insights from here to other kinds of longitudinal qualitative enterprises. It's a really good starting point for us. Julia.
Yeah. Thanks, Liz, I really enjoyed that. Got a question which is probably a simple question, but it's how does the analytic change, or might it change, if you name what you're doing as historical research rather than qualitative longitudinal? What makes it qualitative longitudinal rather than archival research with letters? You know, and do you see a difference methodologically or in the type of analysis that you're building?
I think it isn't. I think there is something that is qualitative and longitudinal about it, which comes from the way that we are collecting and analysing the letters that we're dealing with. So the whole thing has been designed as a kind of an experiment in qualitative longitudinal research. I mean, what I've talked about here it's designed in that sort of way, but what trying to do a formal analysis, how far we might get without considering the detailed content of the data. Are there ways in which we can, to use another terminology, are there ways in which we can model it that might take us quite a long way in thinking out some of the issues about it and provide pointers for where we might go? And I suppose one of the reasons that it's been conceived like that is if you want to say something about social change and the longue durée, how do you actually go about it? So this is an attempt to think through how one might actually go about that business of not just using qualitative longitudinal. I don't mean just in a pejorative sense, but I think qualitative longitudinal research has been largely conceived and is good at looking at things that are very focused and very specific. And I'm interested in whether it can be used to do something much bigger and which can, I suppose, do one of the things that was implicit in some of the things that Alan was saying, which is to ignore the so-called qualitative and quantitative divide. So how is it possible to work at huge volume whilst retaining many of the ideas that will be familiar to people around the room?
I thought it was absolutely fascinating, and the way in which you're, as I understand it, organising and trying to understand the writing of these letters over a long period of time by a vast number of people. What I'm interested in, the question I want to ask of you is, do you think the number of cases that you have will change as you start to look at the detailed accounts within the letters? By which I mean that at the moment you have accounts by families, by relation to people, to each other, over longish periods of time. But your question that you want to ask, or some of the questions you want to ask are about the ways in which they write about their relations to race and whiteness in South Africa, which may change through that long duration.
Do you mean they may change for the individuals, or do you mean...
It may change for the individuals, it may change for the groups, it may change,
yes,
or it may change for several of the groups in several different... So that cases become other cases.
Yes.
As the research progresses, as the research expands its descriptive baseline from the point that you're at now, where you essentially have a survey of the individuals on the social map.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
My point.
Yes, I do. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to conceive what we're doing in terms of particular kinds of networks. So the list that I gave about lawyers and so on. So that what we're trying to do is to stitch together things within particular networks, but also to make sure that there are very different kinds of networks. Yes, that will happen. And what we're trying to do is to start out with sets of letter writings that come from very different parts of South Africa in different archives, written by people from different language groups in South Africa, and build up networks within them, so that there is, I suppose, insofar as it can be done using sort of the happenstance data that's in archives, there is some kind of sampling. So that it isn't just a network and drawing conclusions from a network, it's an attempt systematically to get at very different kinds of networks.
Natasha.
Hi. I'm going to stand up. I can't see you guys. Thank you very much. That was really fascinating. And what I'm interested in is whether you're also taking it under consideration in your analytic gaze the processes through which these letters and the other artefacts that you're looking at have come to be preserved. And to what extent that's also telling you something about what it is you're investigating on social change.
Yes.
And how that fits into the formal analytic framework that you've so carefully laid out for us, where that fits in.
Yes, I mean each of the collections that we're dealing with has information about provenance, and some of them have very detailed information about provenance of how they were collected in the form that they are and how they travelled into archive sources. The Finley one that I mentioned before, Joan Rose Innes, who married one of the Finleys, became the family archivist, and she then was the person who donated the collection. So it's possible to trace it back, and in fact it can be traced back to Donegal, parts of the family anyway, traced back to Donegal in the 1780s, and India and map making in India.
So where does that, I'm just interested in how you're fitting that into your formal analysis. Where, is there a formal bit, as it were, where that's what you're focusing on in terms of analysis, in addition to all those other things you've done?
It might be. There has been various pilot work that's gone into this, but it's only 3 months into this project, although it builds on a long-standing set of inquiries into whites in South Africa, primarily, but not exclusively, focused around Olive Schreiner, but also on various sort of women involved in nationalist networks. So it might well do that, but at the moment it's focused on trying to map a number of large social networks in different areas of the country, coming from different kinds of European origins, because part of this is to look at whiteness and the forms and structures and shapes that whiteness has taken over time in South Africa.
Okay, Andrew.
So I just want to actually push the same question a little further. In your response, you said that you have a lot of the letters, you have detailed information on provenance of where it came from, but in a sense you have information on when the letter comes into visibility of the archives. Whereas I thought the questions really being asked about of all the letters that these people actually wrote, what are the letters that actually have survived into these collections? And then the further question becomes, if it turns out you were able to estimate that in some sense, how then does that reinterpret, or how does that then shape the way you have to deal with the data about how many letters there are, what periods, and that sort of thing?
Yes. Well, I mean, I can give you a rather roundabout response to that. There are somewhere in the order of 4,890 odd extant Olifiner letters. She wrote certainly in excess of 150,000, and I've in various of the work that I've done on the Schreiner letters made some attempt to theorise or model, or whatever your preferred terminology is, the epistolarium that was produced by Ola Schreiner and the relationship of what remains to those that she wrote. So attrition is something in letter writing that I find extremely interesting. So at the moment, we're 3 months into the project, and what we're struggling with at the moment is being able to find sufficient coverage of lots of different kinds of networks. So I take your point, but I think that probably comes at a later stage. But in not all cases is it possible to do that. There are some very large letter collections where you can look at the provenance of it and trace it out in quite a lot of detail. But in others of them, they come in a sense with no history. They're like any other secondary data set that you might get with no clues as to where it came from. So the actual data with the letter collections tends to be quite varied.
Karen.
Thanks very much. Really fascinating to hear you talking about QLR with such a different set of data, or sets of data that you're going to be analysed from the Cardiff event. I suppose...
Sorry, can I ask you what you say? It's different. What
well, the way
difference?
I think the way that you were representing the temporal process of doing the analysis is what I'm interested in. I think that... sorry, I'll go back to the beginning. In terms of analytic insights, I absolutely agree with you that they can be generated from found data and for data that's been produced for the purpose of the particular study. So I thought that I would have absolutely no trouble in understanding that you were trying to widen out from the Cardiff event. I suppose what I'm interested in is the temporal ordering of your own analytic practices. What the consequences might be of doing a formal analysis first and an analysis of the content of the letters second, if that's what you're going to do. I know yours is a long project, so presumably you have quite a lot of time that you can then put to use to be analysing the data in as many different ways as you think appropriate. So my question really is, because I think QLR, one of its strengths is, we are interested in representational practice. We are interested in being reflexive about our representational practice. So my question for you is, given you're doing the formal analysis first, some of which I think you would see some quite strong connections with the kind of analytic work that's been done by other QLR studies with data that's been produced, by the way. But what would the consequences be of doing that before you get to the analysis of what's being communicated, the substantive, the semiotic content, for example?
Well, it is not possible to control what is in collections in historical archives. It is there, and it varies on a case-by-case basis. And so what we decided to do was to try and get a set of ideas of how we might think about each of... what we're dealing with is multiple data sets. They don't all fit together. They're not something I design and go out and collect and it's 42 people and it's all done the same way. They come into archives in different ways, in different trajectories. Some of them are absolutely enormous, some of them are quite tiny. it can't be a case of one size fits all. So the attempt is to develop some kind of formal ideas which can then be used to compare and contrast the different data sets, if you like, if you want to think of the collections as data sets. Because we obviously can't control what is in them. They can't. So that they're all found. So this is an attempt. So what all that this is an attempt to think through what would be some of the interesting formal properties that sort of hang together and provide some interesting things to think about, so that it's possible then to think about something absolutely ginormous, like the Finley family collection, something really quite small from another network, to give us some kind of purchase on the fact that this data isn't shaped and prepared and it doesn't come in a standard form. You take what you get. So the formal analysis is the route that we are working on to give us a set of common points that we can use to think about the different data sets in different collections in different parts of the country that have travelled there by different routes and whole different bunches of people. So imagine everybody in the room's data, you get it, make sense of it. How do you do it?
Casing.
So you keep the cases separate, which is what we're doing.
And then I'll start the merging. And then I'll split them apart, split them asunder, and work out the relation between evidence and ideas as I was going along.
Yeah.
That's what I would do.
That's what we're doing.
Excellent.
Michelle.
Oh yeah, I'm not sure, my question was a little bit pedantic in a way, but I was interested in the temporal ordering and just well, I guess basically when you were describing it, I thought it was more timing, the timing of letters rather than temporal ordering, because I was partly, there's that sort of distinction of time and temporality, and time being a bit more sort of objective or taken for granted.
Time is a bit more objective.
Well, sort of, that if you're talking about time, you might be talking about physical time, or you might be talking about something that ideally would be counted or would be, I would trouble this separation, but there's sort of this objective physical time, and then there's temporality, which is subjective and experiential.
That's why it's called temporal ordering.
Well, because they're also ordered by dates. They're ordered by years. They're ordered. More I was wondering, it seemed to be more time itself wasn't being troubled. So it seemed, and I just wondered if there'd be making that distinction would then allow the temporal to do other work later, rather than if it's used when it seemed to me to be more about time.
Well, in general, it's not. It's temporal ordering. I mean, for example, Bessie Price used fives. She didn't use a 7-day week. So all of and they were done with notches on the on pieces of wood. So they were done in 4s and then a 5 across it. So the dates are social constructions. They're not. They are the temporal ordering.
But I guess that's not coming out in the graph.
Well, it won't come out in that, because this is just. I mean, in 2 years' time, they'll. This project is 3 months old, so this is an attempt to think through some of the implications of trying to use qualitative, longitudinal research for something big, not something eensy-weensy, but something very large. How did South Africa turn out to be as it did, and how did it then change subsequently? And is that possible to do? And what are the means that we might go about it? And so, on one level, dates are, when you work with VRE, the whole thing is structured around dates. That's the only way that it can be written. So on the one hand, dates are treated as an absolute, but also it's recognised that they're a social construction. And that's there are very few other ways in which, if you want to work at huge volume, there are very few other ways in which to do it. So I take your point that there are issues and complexities, but it is a temporal ordering. It's not anything else and not anything other than that. Does that make sense?
We're going to deal with this on behalf, I think, rather than there's a couple more. There's a couple of more, because
thanks, Liz. I really enjoyed that. I mean, to me, it seems what you've set out is a really important part of secondary analysis, because you've got to do a temporal mapping, and that's, for me, that's what you've done, in order to understand your data set. And it's a crucial stage before you can get onto your substantive analysis. You know, I think you've done that beautifully, and you've shown us how you might weave all of those different ways of thinking about time.
I'll tell you what the flaws are.
But what I wanted to come on to is when you get onto your substantive analysis, forgive me because I've got very little clue about the project and its scope, but how much will you, I mean, it seems to me already from what you've been saying that you're going to look at those letters in the context of the historical picture of what's going on. It's a huge project actually, isn't it, to map those letters against all the changes that are going on in South Africa. And I wondered what other sorts of data you will bring those letters into conversation with, or whether you're able to do that, or how you might do that. I was thinking about, it's making me think of Edward Said's work on culture and imperialism, where he looks at the way imperialism is played out through literature, for example, and all those really important ideas for me and really, really interesting. So it'd be great if, there's all sorts of scope here for example, looking at, the fictions. That's Edward Said's point. He focuses on, cultural forms like fiction, but also letters, and how those same ideas might be described in different representational forms, and where you might go.
Yeah, I mean, there's a very interesting set of points. I mean, the flaw in this is that try as we have to remain within a formal analysis, it's impossible to stay there. You have to have recourse to the substantive to make it make sense. So in part, this has been an attempt to do a pure formal analysis. I'm sort of quite interested in how far that can be pushed. And then that's one of the things that lies behind this. This is an attempt to see if it works. The other point that you made about I think is a very interesting one, because obviously it's not possible to do all of this in 3 years and look at the totality of everything that's ever happened in South Africa over that time period. And so what we're doing is we're using this kind of formal analysis to pick out sort of hotspots, if you like. And to an extent, that's places where both the political orthodoxies, but also academic orthodoxies, are telling us things. And I don't like being told things, and I think, is that really so? And could there be something else going on? So one of the things that we're trying to do is to turn this back on itself and to use it to interrogate social science and historiographical, but also political orthodoxies. And I don't just mean those of the bad old apartheid days, I mean those of the present day as well. I think what he said is very helpful, and that one of the dangers of trying to work on this kind of volume is that you get lost in the minutiae of it and lose sight of whether it would be sensible to try and bring the analysis back down to something that is much more focused, and that's the sort of thing that we're. So we're going to take some of these big. I've just finished these kind of orthodoxies about politics and life in South Africa, and try and use this information from differently situated people all over to try and put some kind of diverse light on it. So I'm sorry I mentioned that.
I'm going to just make one last comment, maybe. Also, perhaps just to put together a few of the comments across the day in terms of recurring themes. One of the things I was thinking about, the volume you're working with, in some ways it's also typical of longitudinal qualitative research, that even if you've got a tiny number of cases, even if you're working over time, well, it's immediately out of hand in terms of volume. And I thought it was very interesting, the distinction between the formal features of a data set and the substantive, perhaps, the sort of indexical, at the moment, and that's actually a different distinction between quantitative qualitative, which is, I think, what you were trying to get us to think about, Alan, that maybe the formal indexical is a really useful distinction, and it felt like that was one that was being made across the day. So whether it was the sort of the mapping of culture, you know, the cultural, what do you call it, correspondence map, and then going down into those stories, or your two, you know, your two chalk and cheese examples where formally they're really different. Let's see what that looks like.
And one is huge and one is tiny.
Yeah, let's go in and see what that looks like in sort of indexically. So that seems to be something that's come out consistently today, and also that perhaps it's also, you know, at the moment it's because we can figure these things visually. We can look at the form through kind of visual methods, you know, whether it's the graph or the map, and thinking about perhaps using form as one of the ways of disciplining the undisciplined nature of these data sets where they're just so huge. And I just thought my last thing, so I'm really going out on a limb here, but I was just thinking, Andrew, you talk about, you know, fractal as a sort of metaphor for thinking about things. So sort of you get a certain shape or a certain form, and you might find it on a big scale, but then you might find it small. And it struck me when you were talking about how do you pull this data set together with your different archives everywhere. It's actually quite like a correspondence, isn't it? In a sense, you know, what you're doing at the big scale somehow mirrors the thing you're looking at the small scale as well. So I'm not doing anything more than just saying, oh, look. But perhaps they're useful things for us to draw together today with. So I'd like to say thank you to Liz. I think it's really, thanks for